Welcome to the first episode of The Oriental Despot. I'm your host, Jay Tharapel. Today, I'm going to be talking to my good friend Carlos Martinez about China from where he recently returned. He's someone who has greatly influenced my thinking, particularly on the complex history of actually existing socialism. Carlos, good to see you.
Likewise, buddy. How you doing?
Good. So I wanted to have you on my show to talk about your latest trip to China. How long were you there for?
I think it was like 12 days. We went on the 27th of December and came back on the 8th of January, back to grey, miserable Tory London. This is only time I've ever been to China before is on stopovers on the way to Australia, in fact. So this is the first time I spent any serious time in China and that we've looked around. Like it was part of a tour, a Silk Road tour it was headed by Cynthia McKinney, who I'm sure you're familiar with, the former US Congresswoman. And at a practical level, it was put together by a Chinese-American activist by the name of Li Xiuhen. It was sort of, I found out about it from a mutual friend of ours, Danny Haifeng, who's based in New York City. He writes for Black Agenda Report. And there was like 20 of us on the delegation, mixed bag politically. You had our leftist, kind of socialist, communist, anti-imperialist contingent. And then you had some, I guess you would say, libertarians. At a different end of the political scale. But I guess if there's anything that united us politically, it would have been an anti-war sentiment, and in particular and specifically opposing this kind of new Cold War that's directed very much against China and also Russia at the moment.
It's funny that you mentioned libertarians, because one of the big criticisms that I've had of the left for a long time is that when you ask libertarians about China, they claim all of its successes for capitalism. But we on the left, we don't do that, right? So we on the left, we tend to look at China and nitpick and say, you're not perfect enough. And we have such a perfect abstraction of what socialism or communism is that we don't actually see the benefit in claiming it for our ideology. In a sense, do you think that our enemies on the right, those who defend capitalism, are a lot more pragmatic than we are? I mean, we collectively on the left.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, you go to China, there's really the way people talk about socialism is completely different. And there's, people in China don't really seriously doubt that their system is socialist. Yes, it's a market economy, but it's market socialism. People understand that it's not capitalism because capitalists aren't in control. They don't define policy, and the priorities of the government are manifestly not those of capital. In the US, in Britain, in Australia, in capitalist countries, you've got a political system that is actually, I think it was the US economist Joseph Stiglitz, he defined it as for the 1%, by the 1%. That's our political system, right? That's capitalist democracy, essentially. And manifestly, that's not what exists in China, where government policy is so heavily focused on the needs of the people. You could say there's three major priorities for the Chinese government. They are poverty alleviation, literally eradicating poverty. 2, environmental protection, cleaning up the air and helping to avert climate catastrophe on a global level. And 3, protecting, the unity and integrity of China. And those 3 priorities are the same as the top 3 priorities, generally speaking, of the average Chinese person, which is a completely different political situation to countries like Australia or countries like Britain, where the priorities of the government are totally at odds with the priorities of ordinary people.
I remember there was this one quote, and I forget who said it, but maybe you'd be able to refresh me. But the quote goes something like this: in China, capital exists at the mercy of the state, and in the West, the state exists at the mercy of capital. So this is one of the big questions for me. The question for me has never been in what kind of abstract ideal universe is China communist and socialist. The question for me is, are the power relations between workers and capitalists more tilted in favor of workers in China relative to the West? Because if it's relatively tilted in favor of workers, more so in China, then that means that we can advocate the successes of China's economic system to socialism relative to our own society. So for me, it was always a relative argument. It was never an absolutist argument.
Absolutely. I mean, the quote was Eric Lee. He's a Shanghai-based entrepreneur. And I think that was from John Pilger's film, The Coming War on China. Pilger asks him, well, China's got billionaires, China's got wealthy people, China's got inequality, China's got private business. Isn't it a capitalist country? What makes it different from the US? And Eric Lee kind of laughs. He said, like he doesn't quite get the question. He says, well, you've got billionaires in China, but they can't tell the Politburo what to do. The Politburo tells them what to do. And that's the difference between the US. The US, you've got 20, 30, 40 extremely rich people, and they can essentially tell the White House what to do. The other thing to bear in mind is that, well, there's lots of capitalist countries in the world, including in the developing world. India is a capitalist country. The Philippines is a capitalist country. Thailand is a capitalist country. South Korea is a capitalist country. But those countries haven't been able to solve the problems that China has been able to solve. You can walk around Beijing, you can walk around Xi'an, you can walk around Urumqi, and you don't see any homelessness. You don't see any begging. The streets are very clean. Everything is very well organized. We were in a pedestrian tunnel under West Chang'an Avenue in Beijing. We were about to go into Tiananmen, and one of the delegation from New York said, "Do you notice anything really strange about this tunnel?" And I said, "What?" He said, "It doesn't stink of urine." When was the last time you were in a tunnel in New York or London or Sydney for that matter, and it didn't stink of urine? But because there aren't people sleeping rough, and also because in Chinese cities there are public toilets everywhere, there's no need for tunnels to stink like that. I've been to India numerous times. I know you've been to India numerous times. You step out of the airport in Delhi, and the first thing that strikes you is just the intense poverty. People without a roof over their heads.
That brings up one of the comparisons that has been talked about for a long time, which is the comparison between India and China. So sometimes when I talk to people, especially on the left, who have like an excessively idealistic criticism of China, that they're not living up to the abstraction of what they think socialism is, I say, look, an alternate history could have been far worse. Just look at India. India, communists did not seize power. And in terms of life expectancy, I think they're 15 below China. But that's just not even the full picture. I mean, the full picture is that, just basic sanitation doesn't exist in many Indian cities. And that's something that the Chinese now take for granted. So that means that it's like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They can focus on other things now. I mean, in India, there isn't much freedom for people who are poor to achieve social advances, and a lot of that's because of the caste system. But in China, the question that I wanted to ask you is, do you think that there's like more of a history of rebellion in China that we in the West don't really know about? Because a lot of people forget that China, the current government came to power on the back of a rebellion. Right? Came on the back of a revolution, whereas Western societies haven't had revolutions since before European colonialism began. And so maybe the Chinese are actually better at rebelling at their own system than we are, whereas we're stuck in this way of thinking that we're the only ones who are enlightened and capable of rebelling, whereas in China you just have two populations there. You have tyrants and you have mindless lemmings who have no no say in the system, but really we're just projecting our own weaknesses and our own impotence on another country because that serves the geopolitical interests of our government. So what do you think about that? Do you think that says something about the psychology of the Western left?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I mean, this China ever since, I guess, the emergence of the Qin dynasty in 200 BC, they've had this cycle of imperial dynasties that work well for a certain amount of time, and then when they're not meeting the needs of their people, the people overthrow them and something else comes up in its place. The cycle of dynasties is maybe 200-300 years. So there's definitely this culture of you can maintain legitimacy as long as you're doing a good job. You maintain the heavenly mandate, right?
That's right.
And you can lose that. That's not a given. If people aren't eating, if people are starving, and if they don't have their basic needs met, then you're not going to keep the heavenly mandate.
Indeed, and I remember just about the mandate of heaven. A lot of times it gets compared to the divine right of kings, and I always thought that was a bad comparison because the divine right of kings basically says, I'm the king because God has given me this mandate to rule over you. Whereas in China, the mandate of heaven is actually a mandate for rebellion.
Yeah, exactly.
It's basically saying you're allowed to rebel in the name of heaven.
Yeah, it's pressure in the opposite direction. The divine right of kings is downward pressure from the elite, saying we will rule over you no matter what. Whereas the heavenly mandate is pressure from below, saying the rule must be benevolent and effective, and governance must be good, otherwise we'll overthrow you. Certainly there's
differences there.
Yeah, there is that revolutionary tradition. I think that's there to some degree in India as well. But the fact is, China won its liberation in 1949 through a revolutionary process and was able to do away with feudalism in a very short period of time. They were able to completely transform the land relationships in the countryside at a time when 90% of China's population plus lived in the countryside. So the land revolution laid the basis for everything that China's done, really, because Chinese peasants own their own land, so they have their own home. That's their starting point, right? So even the poorest Chinese peasant in a lot of societies in the developing world would be considered middle class purely on that basis that they own something, they've got their own land, they've got their own home. They're not paying the bulk of their income. Even in a lot of places, it's more than 100% of their income on rent, which is a huge freedom, right? Even if you're a low income, even if you're in international terms in extreme poverty, under $1.75 a day or whatever it is, at the very least, that money is going towards meeting your needs rather than paying landlords. So in Indian terms, or in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, well, you're doing all right. You're middle class. So that's a huge difference between China and India, and then which links into all the other differences. Everyone in China now has access to education. There's 9 years of compulsory education from ages 6 to 15 that's free and it's universal. Everybody has access to clean water. Everybody has access to modern energy. In India, 1/5 the population, 250 million people, don't have access to modern energy. Millions still suffering from malnutrition, from homelessness. As you said, life expectancy much lower than it is in China. So massive differences. And we're talking about a country that defines itself as a democracy that has followed the path set out for it essentially by the West. The West has got this very broad normative narrative around what is democracy and what is ruled by the people, and it's this sort of fetishization of certain procedures around multiple parties and elections run in a particular way and all the rest of it.
But
that strips out the content of the political system, that strips out the content of the democracy, which in China's case is for us, by us, on behalf of the 99%, and in capitalist countries' case is for us, by us, on behalf of the 1%. Ultimately, that's the big difference.
That brings me to Zheng Weiwei. So he's a Chinese professor. I know you're familiar with him. I uploaded a video of a few snippets of what he had to say. And what I found amazing about his talk is that for the first time, I'm starting to see the Chinese look down on the Western system.
China rejects categorically the Western political model. To me, there are certain what I call genetic defects in the Western political model. First, the rational human being assumption. Second, absolute rights. And third, omnipotent procedures. The belief in procedural importance is admirable, but in real practice of Western democracy, the procedures are viewed as sacred and omnipotent. Once the procedural justice has been taken as justice itself and made absolute, the consequence is often substantial injustice. Indeed, the Chinese system of meritocracy today makes it inconceivable that anyone as weak as George W. Bush or Donald Trump could ever come close to the position of a top leadership. As a civilizational state, China's political governance is strongly influenced by its own long political tradition. For instance, the idea of the mandate of heaven, or what I call performance legitimacy. Confucius, as you know, China's most famous ancient sage, admonished the Chinese ruler that water can carry a boat, but can also overturn it, which meant that unless the rulers worked with diligence to ensure good governance, people could rise up and rebel in the name of heaven. There is nothing new about one-party governance in China. In most of the past 2,000 years since the country's first unification in 221 BC, China almost always practiced a kind of one-party rule, or rule by a unified ruling entity, with officials selected through competitive public exams, which was called Keji. Furthermore, in most of the one-party rule eras, we must be honest with history, China was by far a better governed country and more peaceful and prosperous country than European states of the same eras. This kind of state would become ungovernable when the adversarial political model were applied, as in the case of China's 1911 Republican Revolution, when the country copied the American model and degenerated into warlords fighting each other with tens of millions of lives lost in the decades to come.
You didn't see that in the past. I think if you went to China in the late 80s, there would have been a lot of enthusiasm for abandoning their own system within the party and moving towards a liberal democracy. But now you've got the Chinese, basically the Chinese communists in particular, looking into their own ancient civilizational past and saying, yes, we are the rightful successors, we are the continuity of everything great in Chinese history. So how important do you think that's been a revolution in itself, the idea that the Chinese are now starting to look towards their ancient history for vindication rather than a far more orthodox Marxist approach?
Yeah, socialism with Chinese characteristics means socialism and Marxism, but taking on board this kind of huge weight of thousands of years of Chinese history, which is just an obviously smart and sensible thing to do in China because people can relate to it. It kind of reminds me of the way that the Chavistas in Venezuela leverage the legacy of Simón Bolívar. Bolívar is not any kind of socialist, but there are aspects of Bolívar that you can take and that are very popular among the population of South America, in order to promote progressive politics. And I think that's exactly what the Chinese do. You know, if you wanted to really look into it, there's elements of Confucianism that you wouldn't agree with whatsoever, or that are very outdated, that relate to essentially a feudal society, which is exactly what Chinese have got rid of. But there's also elements of Confucianism that are built into Chinese culture, and that can be leveraged towards a socialist project, which is exactly what they do. And it's definitely helping them, as you say, in this situation where A, China is rising, B, the West is in decline. You know, Chinese people, like Danny and a couple of others, and I had a meeting with a researcher from the Chinese Academy of Marxism in Beijing, and we were talking about Trump, and she was saying, you know, Chinese people are completely confounded and baffled that Americans can elect a kind of buffoon like Donald Trump as their president. You know, she said, if Trump in China couldn't get elected as a village prefect, never mind a president. And it really shows off the imperfections of the Western system. That all you need. Let's see, Zhang Weiwei, who you just referenced, he talks about it not being so much a democracy, but a money talkocracy, because money talks, money defines the running of Western politics, right? You know, all someone needs to win a US election is a lot of money, an effective marketing campaign, the backing of a few billionaires. You know, you don't have to have any political experience whatsoever. Compare that to China, where there's absolutely no, like, to be in the top circle, like the top 7 or 8, right, to get into the standing committee of the Politburo. There's no way you could do that without having at least 2 or 3 terms behind you as a minister or as a provincial governor. And you know, to be the governor of a province isn't a small thing. You know, Chinese provinces have an average population of 45 million people. That's 2 Australias, right? If you're governor of Guangdong, that's about 100 million people. And you have to have not just done that job, you have to have done it very well. You have to have a serious record of serving the people, of making millions of people's lives better. In order to do that, you need to be an incredibly committed, an incredibly capable, an incredibly competent person. Then, you know, if you fulfill those criteria and you worked hard for the masses for 30 years plus, then you're in with a chance of getting to the top table. You know, a Donald Trump doesn't get a look in.
So I was looking at China's laws, and if you're responsible as a politician for grafting sums above $400,000, you're liable for the death penalty. Now, I always looked at that and I thought, that's democracy for me. The fact that the laws can punish high officials with the most severe crime for economic offenses against the general population, for me, that's democracy. But unfortunately, we in the West have a very kind of liberal, individual rights-based version of what democracy means, rather than a consequential collective version of what democracy means. Would you agree that these debates, or this debate about what morality actually exists in China, whereas here in the West, the very question about what constitutes democracy is completely pushed to the side, and we're already told this is what democracy is?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we've got there's one single narrative about democracy, no matter how ridiculously flawed it is. You know, there's the classic Winston Churchill quote that people really cling to. You know, well, democracy is the worst political system except for all the others that have been tried. You know, that really makes us feel comfortable, right? It's like, you know, democracy's got its flaws, but it's the best thing that's around. And we can use that to justify a Donald Trump presidency, or a racist buffoon like Boris Johnson being Prime Minister of Britain, and the governments of Britain, of the United States, of France, of Australia. paying next to no interest in the needs of ordinary people. You live in somewhere like Britain, you can see things literally getting worse all the time. Life expectancy is decreasing. Racism is getting worse. There are more racist, violent incidents on the streets than there were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It feels like everything is going in the wrong direction. Unemployment is increasing, casualization is increasing, in-work poverty is increasing, homelessness is increasing. But we don't think about making the connection between all of these problems that we're facing and the decline of our societies and the fact that our political processes don't work because we've got this kind of magic wand of democracy, and that makes us feel good and we feel like, well, we've got the best thing. It doesn't occur to us to ask, well, how come increasingly ordinary people in China are living better than we're living? And that is a question that I think we're going to find ourselves asking a lot more over the next few years as that difference becomes more stark. On average, the quality of life in China is still below that of the average quality of life in the West. But that's the gap is getting a lot closer. That's changing very fast. For example, if you take the showpiece cities, in the US, obviously New York City is the big showpiece city. You take showpiece cities in China, we're talking Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. The Chinese cities have a much better quality of life. They even have a higher life expectancy. If you're in Beijing or Shanghai, life expectancy is 83, 84. In New York, it's 78, 79. The buildings are better, the infrastructure's better. The infrastructure in China, you've been to China, have you?
This was part of my trip to North Korea. So I was in Beijing for a few days, just saw the city, that's it, and then went to DPRK. So I saw DPRK fairly well. I mean, to the extent that you can on guided tours, I guess, and then came back to China for a few days in Beijing. But everything that I saw was pretty impressive.
Yeah, the infrastructure is really phenomenal. Sydney is a long way behind. I don't have to tell you, travel in Sydney is an absolute nightmare.
It is, yeah.
In Beijing, the metro gets you everywhere. It's clean. It's very cheap. I think your typical journey costs maybe 30, 40 cents Australian. It runs throughout the city. As the city expands, as cities will expand, it's not doing so in sprawling suburbs, but you have these groups of apartment buildings, and as soon as they're built, a new metro station is built, the line is extended, and the new area is immediately connected to the rest of the city via metro. Over the last 10 years or so, they've built their high-speed rail network throughout the country, thousands and thousands of miles of high-speed rail. It's by far, I think, 2/3 of the world's high-speed rail now is in China. So we took the train from Beijing to Xi'an, which is it's a decent distance. It's the equivalent of going from New York to Chicago, and in Australian terms, it's like going from Sydney to Brisbane. Like, it's quite a long way. On the high-speed rail in China, it takes 4 hours and 15 minutes.
Right.
Very, very, very comfortable. Like, we were sitting in second class, which is the lowest class that you can sit in, but it felt like being in, I don't know, premium economy on a plane or something like that. Ran at a cruised at 300 kilometers per hour the whole time. Ran completely on time. By the way, for the hardcore socialists around, it's state-owned. The trains were built by a state-owned enterprise. The rails are operated by a state-owned enterprise. So all of those things, increasingly, they're better in China than they are in the West. And that's going to be, I think that's really going to help to transform the conversation that we have about what socialism is. And ultimately, it was Deng Xiaoping who said, at the start of the reform period. What we should aim to do is to catch up with and surpass the West by the middle of the 21st century, and to become the biggest developing country, the biggest developed country. And if we can achieve that, then we will have proven incontrovertibly the superiority of socialism. And that's that's what they're really trying to do, and we in the West are going to have to, on the Western left in particular, are going to have to really face up to that question.
Yeah, and for me, that's the burning question, because my argument has always been very, very simple. China is the next superpower. They've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. They say they're doing so in the name of socialism. Now, whether you agree that it meets the abstract definition, the utopian definition of socialism, we're not supposed to be utopians, by the way, right? But I mean, whether it meets your idea of heaven, right? That doesn't matter. What matters is that we can claim the achievements of China for socialism. Like, for me, I mean, it sounds almost cynical, right? It sounds like a kind of propaganda exercise that I'm encouraging Western leftists to engage in. But it's also something. It reminds me of something Vijay Prashad said.
Now, you see, in the West, we want to have this discussion. Is China communist? Or has it restored capitalism? Classic discussion. Is China... Who are you to condemn it like that? Is that the best framing you can come up with? Why don't you ask a different question? What is the debate inside China around the question of socialism? I would like to hear that discussion, not your understanding of whether it's restored. So you, like the Pope, will now decide whether to excommunicate 1.4 billion people from the camp of socialism. It's not up to you. I want to hear what they are debating, because it's their reality. We have to recognize that as a consequence of the collapse in 91, it was not the left that disappeared in the third world. It was the left that disappeared in the West.
So let's talk about the current debate among the Anglo left, and that refers to the left in Britain and its Anglo settler offshoots, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and of course the United States. So usually the discussion is, is China socialist or capitalist? But I've always felt that such discussions get you nowhere, for the simple reason that, to quote Michael Parenti, the imperfect reality will never live up to the imaginary ideal.
We're in the Western left, we're having these debates about what is socialism, is China socialist, etc., etc. I think it would be helpful to remember that nobody in the Western left has actually figured out how to build socialism yet, and therefore we should start from a place of humility.
Yes.
And if the Chinese say that they're building socialism, and what they have unarguably achieved is to make life better for hundreds of millions of people, they're completely focused on eradicating poverty and developing their country, developing the productive forces, encouraging science and technology, and increasingly becoming a world leader in that field, and furthermore playing a progressive role on the global level in terms of developing a multipolar world system where countries around the world are going to have the opportunity to choose an economic and political system that suits them, rather than having to play ball with Western imperialism. That's a huge contribution to global humanity and to socialism. So, I think starting from a place of humility, we should say, okay, Chinese say they're building socialism, because we're not. we haven't.
And that brings me to something that I've been thinking about as well, which is that you mentioned that we should show a little bit more humility. Now, often people like yourself and myself, we're referred to on the left as Stalinists. Now, I always thought that a better term instead of Stalinist would actually be just humble Marxists. Like, we haven't gone through the struggles that Mao Zedong has, or Zhou Enlai, or any of the great leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. We haven't gone through their kind of struggles. And so let's look at that society. Let's look at countries where communist parties have achieved what we haven't achieved, which is to actually take power and be in charge of their entire civilization. Let's look at them with a little bit more humility. That's always been my approach. And so people say, you're a Stalinist. I say, no, I'm just humble, and you're arrogant. That's the difference between you and me.
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of how we talk about other socialist countries, it feels like it's a bit of a losing battle, do you know what I mean? Because you're facing a sort of permanent McCarthyism in terms of the dominant narrative, in terms of the media portrayal. Everything negative that ever happened in a socialist country is amplified in the education system, in academia, in the media, to a level of complete hysteria. And everything positive people keep quiet about. Was there political persecution in the Soviet Union? Yes, absolutely. Did it go too far? Almost certainly. Did Stalin order the deaths of millions of people? Clearly not. Did the incarceration rate in the Soviet Union ever get anywhere near the incarceration rate in the modern United States of America? Not a chance. So there's this skewed narrative that you're always up against. But that's what people learn to think about in relation to socialism, in relation to the Soviet Union. Like, how about the fact that the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany, without which Europe would probably only just now be emerging from the horrors of fascism, right? And without which probably most of the then colonial world would still be the colonial world if it hadn't been for that. How about the fact that Russia went from being a very backwards country with widespread poverty, with routine famines, with endless racist anti-Semitic pogroms, to being the world's second largest economy, to being an industrial powerhouse, a leading force in the world of science, a place where famine was abolished, and where, for all its limitations and flaws and things that they got wrong, and they were obviously in a very difficult situation with a lot of pressure on them, but they did manage to solve certain problems that capitalism still hasn't been able to solve, right? They were able to provide a decent, dignified minimum to everyone, even if we can look back at it and say, well, that minimum turned out not to be enough. It was still, everybody ate and everybody had a roof over their head, and everybody got educated. It was a very highly educated society. Everybody had access to culture, to music, to theatre. They printed books in their tens of millions. And they were able to get rid of unemployment. They were able to get rid of homelessness. These kind of scourges of modern capitalist society that Australia can't fix, Britain can't fix, the US can't fix, right? But we've been trained not to think about these things. So when we talk about them, our starting point is very low, and we're fighting this losing battle. The other thing is that all of the countries that have experimented with socialism so far have been relatively poor, relatively backward countries. Like, an awful lot of people in the West still live better than their counterparts in the socialist countries. And therefore, in a sense, it's difficult to advertise some of those successes. Oh, well, great, people have homes. Well, I've got a home. People learn to read. I can read, So, and obviously, one of the big reasons that we have relatively high living standards is that a lot of that's based on colonialism and imperialism. So,
and the red 20th century.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like it forced Western countries to give their citizens some concessions in the form of a welfare state, because a country like the Soviet Union existed.
Absolutely. But I think that brings us to what you were talking about earlier. Like, that dynamic is going to change as China continues to race ahead. Once China is actually ahead, once ordinary people in China are clearly living better than ordinary people here in Britain, in Australia, we're going to have to ask ourselves, how have they done that? And ultimately, the only available answer is, well, they've got a socialist political system, and that's enabled them to prioritize the interests of their people and to move forward at an unprecedented pace without having access to colonialism, without having access to imperialist looting. You know, it's a peaceful country. It doesn't go to war. It's not exploiting other countries, but it's still been able to build a better lifestyle for its people than we have.
And that concludes our first episode. Thank you very much for joining us. Unfortunately, we couldn't get decent video streaming today, which I will blame on the awful state of Australian internet these days and the late stage of the Anglo Empire and its terminal decline. But in future, I hope on making the video stream happen by purchasing the software that I need. You can find my work on theorientaldespot.com, and to find Carlos Martinez, it's very easy. Just Google inventthefuture.org. See you next time.